Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the United Nations Security Council is due to hold an emergency session in an attempt to ease tensions in the Korean Peninsula. Yesterday, North Korea tested a long-range missile which may be capable of reaching Alaska. The US and South Korea carried out their own missile drills in response, with the US Secretary of State warning Washington would never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. Our Bangkok correspondent Jonathan Miller reports.
Having crossed the ICBM threshold yesterday, North Korea taunted Trump again today with pictures of the launch. State media said Kim Jong-un feasted his eyes on this with a broad smile on his face. A contagion of anxiety has rippled round the globe over the paranoid nuclear-armed dictator's demonstration of defiance. NKTV today re-ran yesterday's announcement of the test. Mrs. Ri Chun-hee, the anchorwoman, quoted Kim Jong-un as calling this a 4th of July gift for the Yankees, intended, and I quote, to slap the American bastards in the face. South Korea's President Moon Jae-in today ordered a show of force. It was no longer sufficient to respond with statements, he said, as US and South Korean troops fired deep strike precision missiles in drills on the peninsula's east coast, and talk turned again to war plans. Defense chiefs released a video featuring an animated resumption of a war that was put on pause in 1953, with surgical strikes on regime targets in Pyongyang. Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, meanwhile warned of repercussions for any country aiding and abetting what he called a dangerous regime. With no international consensus over what to do, Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping, whose countries both border North Korea, continued to urge restraint. If North Korea agrees to freeze its nuclear and missile development programs, Putin said, the US and South Korean war games should stop too. Friday's G20 summit is shaping up to be a fractious affair. Trump's en route tonight, but the first time he met Xi 3 months ago, the two were matey, less so now. He repeatedly asked China to lean on Kim Jong-un. Recently he tweeted, "It's not worked out."
I think that President Trump greatly overestimated China's willingness and ability to control events on the Korean Peninsula. And this is not, no offense to President Trump. Many Americans overestimate China's influence over North Korea because they're living in the past.
Today, Kim Jong-un is a global problem and presents a clear and very present danger. He rules a rogue state with no real friends at all. He may be reckless, but nukes and missiles make him feel secure. He says his weapons program's non-negotiable, but getting him to the table is looking like the only option going.
Well, that meeting of the United Nations Security Council is about to get underway, and our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins me now from the Pentagon. Kylie.
Yes, Kathy, whether or not you're in the UN Security Council in New York or here at the Pentagon, certainly there is now a very urgent discussion as to how to respond to this. The generals here now confirming that with this second stage added to a missile, Pyongyang can potentially, with the right targeting, land a missile as far away as Alaska. The problem, I think, for Donald Trump, regardless of his rhetoric, is that there are no good military options here. We saw that instant retaliation, or very quick retaliation yesterday from the US and South Korea, firing missiles into the sea off North Korea. But you can't imagine, and there is no scenario which would not involve staggering civilian casualties, both in South Korea and well beyond. Meanwhile, at the Security Council, certainly the US wants to see states adhering to, even increasing pressure in terms of sanctions on Pyongyang. But as Jonathan was explaining, neither Russia nor China see the problem presented by an increasingly belligerent North Korea in the same way as the US does.
So how much of a test is this for President Trump then?
Well, now it's incredibly serious, Kathy. I mean, this isn't about putting NATO's noses out of joint. This isn't about picking a fight with the mayor of London. I mean, Donald Trump has always said that he would fix this problem of North Korea. He would be leaning on China to do that. He's just left Washington, D.C., headed to that meeting that Jonathan mentioned with President Xi. But can he bring about an outcome that satisfies the U.S.? Can this extraordinary deal maker make Beijing come up with a resolution that it neither needs or wants to deliver?
Kylie, thank you very much. John.
Well, we're joined now by Christopher Hill, the former US ambassador to South Korea and Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Public Affairs. He led the US delegation for 5 years in talks that aimed to reach an agreement with North Korea over its nuclear program. But Christopher Hill, I understand, and thank you very much for joining us, that you now no longer think there really is any value in talking to North Korea.
Well, first of all, when I talked with North Korea in the context of the six-party talks, it was actually quite important that we did that because many South Koreans were blaming the United States for the fact that we had this impasse, and they had a point, that is, the U.S. was refusing to talk. So it was important to talk. It was also important to show the Chinese that we were prepared to look at this diplomatically and find a diplomatic solution. Actually, Kim Jong-il, that is Kim Jong-un's father, was also interested. And so we actually did make some progress. There was absolutely nothing wrong with talking. And I think today there's nothing wrong with keeping the door open to talks. But what is different is that Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un, has shown zero interest in any kind of denuclearization. Whereas his father agreed to abandon the nuclear programs, the son has said, we'll never abandon nuclear programs. So I think we have a big problem with him. And while I say keep the door open to talks, I think it's very important that we work with our allies in the region, Japan and South Korea, and also extremely important that we work with China. I think the problem is that President Trump, first of all, oversold the notion that he could bring this to a solution. And secondly, he seemed to want to outsource the whole thing on China. Right. I think if China is going to be part of a solution, they need to do it with the U.S. together.
Well, why is he doing this now? Why is Kim doing this?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un has never pulled back from the idea of a rapid nuclear developing nuclear capabilities. So we know that up until this year, in fact, in 2016, he had 2 nuclear tests, a couple before that. So we are looking at 5 nuclear tests, during which they probably made some progress in terms of miniaturization of their warheads. And then he has really unleashed quite a missile barrage in the last couple of years, basically working on the idea of solid fuel rocketry. So he is clearly interested in pursuing this and doesn't really care what we think or what we say. And so I think it's very important that the U.S. and China get together, not just for the purpose of bringing the North Koreans back to talks that they don't want to participate in unless they're talks on the basis of their being a nuclear power talking to other nuclear powers. I think it's very important that we sit down with the Chinese and figure out what we can actually do about this to retard their program.
But Mr. Hill, this very day, the president has said so much for working with China. He's kind of written them off. This feels very, very dangerous. It feels the most dangerous moment since you began your talks 5 years ago more.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that we have a president who has barely understood what the issues are, let alone what their nuances are. I'm not sure tweeting about this kind of thing, dismissing China, or using this kind of playground type rhetoric about these issues is going to get us there. I think we do need to get the international community involved in this. This is not just a U.S. or China problem. Frankly speaking, the Europeans should be much more involved in this threat.
Right.
So I think Rex Tillerson is absolutely right. I think we need to bring this to the UN, not just about sanctions, but about the more immediate threat. So I think that's right. But as for the tweeting, what can I say? I think the president needs to defend that, because I can't.
Christopher Hill, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. And of course, that issue is at the United Nations as we speak.
President Trump was never going to back down in the face of North Korea test-firing a missile that could potentially reach the United States. Well, was he? As he set off for Europe tonight, he was asked about the North Koreans. We're going to go get them, the president told reporters. His ambassador at the United Nations used slightly more formal language, but the message was the same. She talked about being prepared to use military force if we must.
Almost drowned out by the sound of the presidential helicopter, the question was about North Korea. The first answer, we're going to go get them. The second, we're going to do very well. With these off-the-cuff, unthought-through replies, or 10 words which suggest the president is shifting in his thoughts towards a potential military response to North Korea's missile launch. At an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, the US ambassador certainly seemed to suggest the chance of a diplomatic resolution was diminishing.
The United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies. One of our capabilities lies with our considerable military forces. We will use them if we must, but we prefer not to have to go in that direction.
So far, this is the response to North Korea's missile firing. A joint US-South Korean drill off the Sea of Japan. It was a visible show of military might to Pyongyang and a warning of what could follow. However, it came just hours after the Russian and Chinese presidents warned the United States against just these sorts of exercises. That defiance suggests the president may have run out of patience with those who could potentially influence Kim Jong-un. The president's morning tweet reinforcing that view. Trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter, he wrote. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. Those who've spent their lives seeking diplomatic solutions to international crises believe disregarding China would be a strategic error.
The president has said, if China won't solve this, I will. There's not an easy solution to North Korea that doesn't involve a very significant risk of war, and that war would produce hundreds of thousands of casualties on all sides.
For now, as North Korea releases footage of its missile launch, the war is a propaganda one. Around the world, there is a hope that will be the only war waged between the two nations. Emma Murphy, News at 10 in the United States.
At the emergency meeting of the UN Security Council tonight to discuss the response to the threat from North Korea, the US ambassador says the latest missile test represents a sharp military escalation. But the pressure is on President Trump to agree to a measured response after he has raised the rhetoric on North Korea since he entered the White House. When the missile was fired, he tweeted, "Perhaps China will put the heavy moves on North Korea and end this nonsense for once and all." So will China, who said military action is simply not an option, agree to the US plan to propose new UN sanctions against Pyongyang. Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
So Kim Jong-un has ridden the rocket of brinkmanship again. By testing a missile with a range long enough to hit parts of the US, he's thrown down a gauntlet, unbowed by American threats, and also resolved a technical challenge.
We assume that North Korea has that capability with its medium-range systems because they have been testing those successfully for so long, and of course North Korea has had a number of nuclear tests. But you're right, we'll never know for sure whether they have an operational capability unless they have to use it.
The new missile test led the US to say that peace on the Korean Peninsula is a choice they could change, and that diplomacy is running out of steam.
Their actions are quickly closing off the possibility of a diplomatic solution. The United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies.
So where does that leave Donald Trump? Early in January, the president tweeted that Kim's bid to develop a nuclear weapon capable of hitting the US won't happen. Some thought that was a threat of force, but he'd enlisted China's help. In April, he suggested China could get better trade terms if they solved the North Korean problem. Late last month, with missile tests continuing, he rued, "At least China tried." Today, resignation gave way to anger. So much for China working with us, accusing them of ramping up trade with North Korea rather than squeezing it.
When Trump made his deal with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, perhaps he wasn't fully aware of the history of U.S. efforts to elicit better cooperation from China. And if he was, he probably would have been more careful in his approach to Xi Jinping. But we are where we are.
China's President Xi Jinping today pointedly insisted that Vladimir Putin was his country's closest partner. And in the context of North Korea, that hints at an alignment to provide an alternative to America's threats of force.
I think that Russia-China cooperation does have significant implications for North Korea because it essentially, at the end of the day, presents an opposing option for North Korea, if you will. North Korea is a client state of China. Russia is actually the other main trading partner of North Korea's, and in some way they sort of legitimize North Korea's existence.
America and South Korea today conducted their own missile firing drills, a warning to Kim Jong-un, but also a reminder to China that the US is not about to abandon its regional partners. But for all the symbolism, there's little appetite in the Pentagon for the military options.
Well, I think President Trump is finding, as previous presidents have found, that we really don't have any capability to stop North Korea from advancing its nuclear and missile program. Military options are obviously not practical because we're not capable of knocking out North Korea's nuclear and missile systems. And in any event, even if we tried, that's likely to lead to a general conflict on the Korean Peninsula, which the U.S. and U.S. allies, South Korea and Japan, are not prepared to fight.
Given the risks of using force, the Chinese option was probably worth a try. But Kim Jong-un continues weapons tests undaunted, and while President Trump formulates a new policy, China holds nearly all the key cards.
Mark Urban. Well, Bill Richardson, a former Democrat governor, has negotiated with North Korea since the 1990s. He was involved in securing the release of U.S. student Otto Warmbier. Good evening, Bill Richardson. First of all, how do you rate this particular moment historically?
Well, this is the worst state of tension in the Korean Peninsula since the Korean War, with this ICBM capability that North Korea now has, with the Kim Jong-un acting in defiance, not just of the United States, but the international community, detaining Americans, Canadians there, basically thumbing his nose at the international community and trying to provoke Donald Trump and the G20 into basically saying, hey, you guys are meeting at the G20. I'm the main player in the world today. That's what Kim Jong-un is saying.
But if it is one of the most dangerous moments since the Korean War, is it also a moment of opportunity?
Well, I believe the only way we're going to get out of this North Korean drama is through diplomacy. But right now, the options of diplomacy, because of the Otto Warmbier case, there's no appetite for that diplomacy. The preemptive military strike, that right now I don't think is realistic. So in between, we should look at options of squeezing China to squeeze North Korea more. I don't think we've done enough. I think more cyber efforts, more sanctions at the UN, get the international community, the G20 countries, a new alliance. I think we have a little time.
Well, in fact,
but not much more.
Nikki Haley, the American ambassador at the UN, has talked about the fact that America will propose sanctions. But of course, you have to have China on board. And I just wonder, you talk about pushing China harder, but what leverage does Donald Trump actually have on China at the moment?
Well, they're negative levers. Do we list them as a currency manipulator? Do we put some kind of trade sanctions on steel? Do we continue arms sales to Taiwan? And other efforts. You know, China wants to be preeminent in East Asia, buttress our relationship with South Korea, with Japan, commerce-wise, militarily. I think China has to realize that the turmoil in the peninsula is not in their interest, but they're unwilling to really risk anything by squeezing North Korea. So we have to put more levers on China, and we need to get our European friends to help us, because this affects the international community, the East Asian Peninsula.
I mean, this may be something, of course, as a Democrat that you would have a certain answer for, but isn't part of the real problem here the kind of instability that the kind of flip-flopping that Donald Trump undertakes? You know, the goading of China for not doing enough for North Korea, the idea that he could do it himself, the idea that they would never have an interballistic missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, that Trump is playing with fire without essentially understanding what he's doing.
Well, look, the fire is caused by Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans. As a Democrat, I think Trump has been relatively restrained. You know, I don't like his tweeting. I don't like him saying he wants to meet Kim Jong-un, and that would be an honor. I want him to have a coherent policy with his military advisors, with our allies, bring it up at the G20, maybe get Russia's help, try something new. But I think diplomacy is the only option. There is no sound military option. And I think Kim Jong-un wants to provoke the international community. We shouldn't let him get away with that. We should be united in our effort to squeeze him. And the key is China, and China has not stepped up.
Well, but I want to come on to the kind of the role that you have played in the past. And I would say that, you know, the G20 is going to be a very public thing. State-to-state diplomacy is not exactly been shown to working. Are there back channels that need to be activated very quickly and strongly?
Yeah, let's look at new back channels, private groups, perhaps the Vatican. Perhaps China can play a mediating role by saying to Kim Jong-un, you've got to sit down and talk to the South Koreans and the Americans. Let's give this new president of South Korea, who's ready to engage North Korea on humanitarian issues, maybe he can be a channel. But let's try something new, because the traditional China, U.S., South Korea in the past six-party talks, that's not working.
Are you optimistic?
Strategic patience is not working.
Just briefly, are you optimistic on a scale from 1 to 10?
Well, I'm at about a 3 right now,
okay.
And it's dwindling. I'm worried. I'm really worried. But I think eventually the international community will develop a strategy, and hopefully Kim Jong-un will come to his senses. But I wouldn't count on it right away. I think he's going to stretch it out.
Bill Richardson, thanks very much indeed.